Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
In August this year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released its sixth assessment report saying that it was a code red for humanity and that if we didn't act on climate change now, it would have dire consequences for Earth and all of its inhabitants. But what does climate change look like? Today we have Simon Mundy, who is the editor of Moral Money at the Financial Times. He also writes about climate change, sustainability, and the environment. Can you hold up your book for us? The book that we are discussing today is Race for Tomorrow: Survival, Innovation, and Profit on the Front Lines of the Climate Crisis. So welcome to ThePrint.
Thank you so much.
So you've traveled 2 years across 6 continents to write this book. I'm interested particularly in the structure of it. You've decided to sort of divide chapters by crisis or solution, looking at particular places and particular people. And the lifeblood sort of the book is the people's lived realities. So why did you choose to write a book this way?
So I was living actually in India when I had the idea for this book. I was the Mumbai correspondent for the FT at the time. And very soon after I arrived in India, I made a trip to Marathwada in Maharashtra state. And I was looking at the very severe droughts that was affecting farmers there, which, according to scientists, is very much linked with climate change. And that was a real wake-up call for me to see the extent to which people today are already struggling in a very, very real way with the impacts of climate change. And it struck me that this was something that could be helpful for me as a journalist to do, to share more of those stories more widely with people all over the world who recognize that this is a big and important subject, but are struggling to get their heads around it, to get to grips with it. It's such a huge subject. It's got all sorts of political angles, people taking very strong and loud positions on it. But behind this, there's a lot going on the ground in terms of people's individual stories. So I decided to try to approach the whole global story in that way. And obviously this required a lot of time and a lot of travel. So it required me to take 2 years living out of a suitcase, basically, and traveling through 26 countries altogether. And I wanted to shed light on many different sides of the story. It's not possible to cover every single angle, of course, but I wanted to cover the stories of people who are dealing with the physical impacts of climate change. I also wanted to deal with the stories of the people who are driving those physical impacts, be it through in the fossil fuel industry, people who are driving deforestation in the Amazon. What's their story? What do they have to say for themselves? I wanted to speak to them also. And of course, I wanted to speak to some of the people who are driving some of the extraordinary solutions that we have available to this, largely in the field of clean technology. So many exciting things happening there. I wanted to share their stories too. So the characters in the book, and it is very much a character-driven book. It's not so much me giving my opinions. It's the stories of the people that I met, and some of them are among the poorest people in the world. Some of them are among the richest people in the world. There are people from every walk of life represented there. And the reader can really hear their stories and decide for themselves what they think this all adds up to and what people think for themselves is the right way to tackle these problems.
Right. So, the way you tell each story is very compelling, and, you sort of bring in these really exciting ideas. The first chapter is about how melting permafrost in Siberia is causing a tusk rush on the one hand, but is also kind of, propelling these interesting ideas of bringing back the woolly mammoth to try and sort of tackle climate change. But what I noticed is that you also sort of refrain from getting into a more critical sort of view of some of these ideas. This woolly mammoth thing sort of blew up, the media caught on to it. It made headlines everywhere. And it was also severely criticized for, how expensive it could be and how it could eventually be futile. So why don't you sort of get into those aspects also?
This book, as I mentioned, it's almost written in the tradition of travel writing. It's sort of old-fashioned reporting in some ways. And there is, at the end of the book, there's an afterword in which I give my personal thoughts on how I think we should move forward. But really, I felt that one thing that has been scaring people off from reading about this subject is the sense that whenever you read about this subject, you're going to be lectured, you're going to be shouted at, you're going to be confronted with someone else's very strongly held opinion telling you what to think. That's the preconception that a lot of people have about books on climate change. Now, I think that some books that do set out manifestos and clear political opinions, to be clear, I think some of those books are great, and I've enjoyed some of them personally. But many people are scared off by that sense. So I thought, if there's a book that is simply taking you on a journey, introducing you to people and places, and focusing on that angle, that's something which can draw people in. So, for example, GQ magazine said this is a climate change book that you would want to read on the beach. So that's the sort of thing that I was going for, the sense of taking the reader on a journey and minimizing the extent to which I was putting my own personal voice in there. The other thing is that on many of these things, I'm not a scientific expert. I also consider it important for me not to be an activist. I'm very much a reporter. And generally speaking, as a reporter, you try to leave your own opinions out of the story, and simply present the facts, present the stories, focus on the most important angles there, and allow the reader to decide for themselves what they think it means.
Usually climate change, the narrative around climate change is all sort of gloom and doom. But this doesn't sort of take that, it changes that narrative a bit. Is that, I was also wondering about your encounters with climate change deniers, because they don't make an appearance in the book. Why choose to leave out that voice? And also, what have some of your own encounters been?
Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting point. So I did visit during my research one institution in particular in the US, which has been very strongly pushing back against the scientific consensus on climate change. And the US chapter, in the end, I was focused on startups. I didn't find a natural way in. But it's a good question as to why deniers of the science don't make an appearance in the book. I think 10 years ago, if I'd written this book 10 years ago, they certainly would have done. But today, to be honest, that group of voices has really become quite marginal. I think it's no longer driving the global conversation in a serious way. What I found more interesting was the voices that I heard in Australia, where you had people saying that actually, our coal is relatively cleaner than Indonesian coal, so we should burn more of our coal. There are sort of more nuanced approaches being taken there. There's a really interesting book called The New Climate War, written by a scientist called Michael E. Mann. He says that actually the pushback against climate action has moved on somewhat from the straightforward denial of climate science. And it's now moving into more subtle forms of pushing back against action. For example, putting the focus on individual consumer choices, on individual carbon footprints as a distraction from the need for systemic change. So everyone focuses on, we should fly less or we should eat less meat and these things, which do help at the margins, by the way. But if we're really to tackle the climate change, we need to be thinking about things like putting a tax on carbon, for example, things that could be more uncomfortable for certain big vested interests. And I think that's a really, really important point, actually, that we do need to be thinking about systemic change. And I think there's a lot in the book that can give some ideas as to how that could work.
Your chapter on India focuses on this debate around GMO crops and the anxiety around it. the Indian government, as you've rightly pointed out, has only allowed a certain type of cotton crop to be genetically modified. But you also, in other chapters, explore lab-grown meat and plant-based meat that is also sort of engineered. So do you see any common anxieties across the world when it comes to what we eat and the effect it has on the planet?
Yeah, so in India, I chose to focus on GM foods, as you say, and that was in part because it's a particularly topical issue in India. So there are three main characters in the India chapter. One is a farmer in Maharashtra state called Tulsiram, and he told me in some detail about the challenges that he's facing as a result of drought. Then there's someone called Usha Zer at a company called Mahiko, which is a big biotech company. And she says, look, if we can genetically modify crops to be more resilient against rising temperatures and droughts, then this could be a powerful tool to be made available to farmers like Tulsiram. And then I also met Vandana Shiva in New Delhi, who is one of the most prominent activists in the world against GM crops, against what she calls big ag, the sort of big agricultural companies. And she says that we need to move back to more traditional organic methods. And taking these three viewpoints together, it really shed light on what is a much wider debate that's happening all over the world, which is how far are we willing to use very radical forms of technology in addressing the challenges of climate change. As you mentioned, there's another angle I found on this debate, which is to do with the production of meat. There are more than 1 billion cattle in the world, and they emit huge amounts of methane. Huge amounts of forest are cleared to make way for them. I saw that happening right up close in the Amazon.
Yeah.
And the global demand for meat is going up and up, largely driven by China and other developing countries. So we're going to have to provide some sort of protein to these people. The demand is there. How do you fill that demand? So it's either through cattle, which has very serious implications for the climate. But then there are two companies that I visited that are coming up with high-tech forms of alternative meat. So one of them is Impossible Foods, based in California, which is already making burgers and other forms of meat made from plants. And they use a GM ingredients, actually, to make this plant-based stuff taste uncannily similar to meat. And the other company I visited in Israel, Aleph Farms, this is a whole other level of technology where they're actually growing meat from the cells of cows in bioreactors and actually growing steaks in tanks. Now, many people would be very uncomfortable with that. It sounds a bit like some sort of Frankenstein type technology. But the CEO of Aleph Farms said to me, well, look, I mean, it's got minimal carbon impact compared with all those cows. It's got no impact on the rainforest. You don't have all the antibiotics that are pumped into cattle and in the industrial meat production. There's no animal suffering. There's no animals being killed. So, these are quite powerful points. And so people will have to decide how far are they willing to get comfortable with these sort of frankenfoods, as people call them, or how far do they want to stick to conventional meats with all the environmental impacts that entails? There are some really, really fascinating and important questions that are raised by all these things.
So, like I mentioned earlier, you traveled for 2 years across all of these continents, collecting all of these stories. What would you say is one of your biggest learnings of witnessing survival when it comes to climate change? What will survival look like in the years to come?
One thing that I realized, which struck me very prominently and something quite specific, is migration. People are already on the move in growing and already very large numbers. I saw this particularly in Bangladesh. So everyone knows that the southwestern part of Bangladesh is very low-lying. Parts of it will be progressively flooded in the years ahead. But already something that we're seeing is the penetration of salt water further and further inland, which is destroying rice farming across that region of Bangladesh. And so rice farms are becoming shrimp farms, which require much less labor. So people are finding themselves landless and unemployed. So of course they move, they hit the road, and they largely head to the capital, Dhaka, where they live in many cases, terrible conditions in horrifically overcrowded slums. And this problem is getting worse and worse. And it's not just going to be in Bangladesh. The World Bank estimates that we're going to have well over 100 million refugees in the decades to come. And this is something which is going to affect, most of these people will move within their own countries, but also many of them will move internationally. And I think every large country, be it India, be it European countries, be it the US, are going to have strategies to deal with the displaced people here. It's going to have all sorts of implications for domestic politics. And simply at a basic human level, you know, we really need to think about how we're going to help the people who in growing numbers are going to be displaced, because it's already happening and it's going to happen at larger and larger scale. And I think it's not quite being emphasized enough in policy discussions yet.
That's interesting. It's interesting that you say that, given this book is also coming out at the heels of the COP26. What do you make of the discussions over there, which are, you say, may not have dealt with climate migration and climate refugees as much? Climate justice was also a huge issue. Climate finance was also a huge issue. So what were your takeaways from that too?
Yes, I was in Glasgow for the full 2 weeks, and it was actually the first COP that I've been to, because I've previously been a foreign correspondent. I wasn't an environmental journalist until the last few years. So it was very interesting for me. I think there was a huge mix of people there. Big business was represented at this COP far more than any previous COP. So on one level, it's a good thing that big business is getting involved. On the other hand, many people have concerns about the extent to which big business is influencing the outcomes along lines potentially that are very helpful for big business and less so for other people. So that's a concern that many people have. I was struck by the relative levels of ambition. Mm-hmm. I felt that many people, I spoke to people who were more influential in business or politics, tended to be quite cautious in their proposals for what could be achieved. The young activists I spoke to were far more ambitious. And some might say it's that level of ambition we need when you think about the scale of the challenge that we face. I was very disappointed to see the extent to which India, in particular, along with China, was scapegoated at the end of the conference. In case anyone watching may need to be reminded, there was this change which was proposed by India to change phase out of coal to phase down of coal in the final text. Now, I don't think, I wasn't pleased to see that change at all. I would have liked it to stay as the original language. But that language, phase down, had previously been published in a joint statement between the US and China. It's there on the US State Department website. This is language that had been explicitly endorsed by the United States along with China before that final text was there. So I think it was awfully convenient for some in the West to pin the blame on China. And I think India can very fairly say, well, hold on, there was an explicit promise of $100 billion a year in climate finance to help countries like India to move faster when it came to moving away from coal. And that promise was broken. And it's not going to be kept anytime very soon. So therefore, I think I really think if you look at the historic responsibility for cumulative carbon emissions on a per capita basis, especially, the responsibility is so overwhelmingly with the richest countries in the world, and countries like India on a per capita basis, especially, bear relatively far less responsibility. I think any truly just solution to the climate crisis at a global level will involve far greater levels of support from the richest countries to other countries. We're not seeing that support yet. We didn't see any significant movement on that at COP26. And I think until that movement happens, we're not going to see an effective global response to this crisis.
All right. Well, thank you so much for speaking with us. Thank you for your time. And for anybody watching, for more videos like this one, please do subscribe to ThePrint.
Thank you so much.